There are some things in this world that were never meant to be understood. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some knowledge is a curse disguised as discovery. Welcome to Eerie Short and Scary Stories. Tonight, I'll share something that still haunts me, an experiment that was never supposed to happen, a mistake that couldn't be undone. I was there. I saw it unfold. And if you're listening now, it might already be too late. I never should have gone looking for Carter Bale's stills. The locals warned me. They told me the woods weren't safe, that people went missing out there, and those who came back, well, they were never the same. I should have listened. I should have turned around the second I heard the first story, but I didn't. I was obsessed. Carter Bale was just a name to most, a legend, a ghost story whispered in bars after one too many drinks. But to me, he was more than that. He was a puzzle. A man who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his stills and the eerie tales of those who claimed to have seen him, after he was supposed to be dead. And so, on a cold October night, I set out to find what remained of him. The woods were silent at first. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that presses against your ears, heavy and unnatural. No crickets. No rustling in the brush. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the dead leaves. And then, something else. A whisper. I stopped, breath hitching. It was faint, too soft to make out the words, but it was there. A voice. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was no one. Just darkness, stretching on forever. I told myself it was the wind. That's what any sane person would do, right? But deep down, I knew better. Still, I kept going. After what felt like hours, I finally saw it, the cabin. Hidden beneath the twisted arms of the trees, nearly swallowed by the forest itself. It was old, leaning to one side, the wood blackened with age and rot. And yet, the door was open, just enough to see inside. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic bubbling. It didn't make sense. The place was abandoned. No one had lived here for decades, and yet, something was cooking. I should have turned back. Any rational person would have. But I wasn't thinking rationally. I was too close. I stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place. Something metallic. Something wrong. And then I saw it. The still. It stood in the corner, covered in dust, its pipes twisted like veins. And inside, the liquid was moving. Slow, deliberate ripples, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just leftover rainwater, collected over years of abandonment. That was the logical answer. The only answer. But then, the whisper came again. Closer this time. I spun around, heart pounding. The doorway was empty. The woods outside were still. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now. A weight in the room, pressing against my skin. Watching. I took a step back, and the floor groaned beneath me. The whisper turned into something else. A low, ragged breath. Not mine. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, gasping for air, my chest burning. Only then did I dare turn around. The cabin was gone. Not hidden, not obscured by the trees. Just gone. As if it had never been there at all. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. The bubbling. The whisper. And Carter Bale, calling my name. Carter Bale wasn't just any moonshiner. He was the kind of man who could turn a handful of rotten corn and a bucket of creek water into the smoothest, meanest liquor this side of the Mississippi. People swore up and down that one sip of Carter's shine could knock a grown man flat, and 2 sips could make him see things that weren't meant to be seen. But that didn't stop folks from buying. During the Great Depression, When men were selling their wedding rings for scraps of food and women were patching the same dress until it was more thread than fabric, Carter was sitting high. His stills were tucked deep in the woods, hidden where only a fool or a desperate man would dare go looking. He had customers from one end of the county to the other, men with empty pockets but just enough spare change for a jar of the strongest stuff around. They called it Bale's Fire. And it wasn't just strong, it was perfect. Too perfect. That's when the whispers started. Some folks said Carter had a trick, some secret ingredient that made his liquor burn just right, made it go down smooth and keep men coming back no matter how broke they were. Others weren't so sure. They said he'd struck a deal, that he wasn't working alone out there in those woods. There was a story, one the old folks told in hushed voices when the nights got too long. They said Carter had been out running a fresh batch when a storm rolled in. The kind of storm that comes without warning, thick and angry, swallowing the sky in a matter of minutes. Carter should have turned back. Anyone else would have. But he kept going. By the time the storm broke, Carter had made it back, dragging a wagon loaded with shine that should have been ruined by the rain. But it wasn't. In fact, folks said that was the night his liquor got even better. Too good. That's when things started happening. First, it was the animals. The hunting dogs refused to go near his land, whimpering and tucking their tails between their legs. Then, men who worked with him started falling sick, their eyes bloodshot, their hands shaking. Some left town without a word. Others weren't so lucky. And then, the boy. No one knows why he wandered into Carter's woods. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he was dared. Either way, by the time he stumbled back out, his eyes were wide and blank, his mouth moving in soundless terror. The doctor said it was poison, fumes from Carter's stills. But his mother didn't believe that. She stood in the middle of town, her face streaked with tears, and she cursed Carter Bale with every ounce of breath she had left. Said he was a greedy man, a wicked man. Said he'd pay. Said something was coming for him. And maybe she was right. Because after that, Carter started changing. He stopped coming into town. Stopped meeting with his usual customers. His stills kept running, but no one ever saw him anymore. And then one day, just like that, he was gone. No body. No note. Just gone. His cabin stood empty, his stills abandoned, as if he'd never been there at all. And yet, some say, on certain nights, if you go out to where his stills used to be, you'll hear it. The bubbling. The sound of something cooking in the dark. And if you listen close enough, you might just hear Carter Bale whispering your name. Carter Bale never believed in curses. He had laughed in the town square when the old woman pointed her shaking finger at him, when she spat her warning into the dirt at his feet. A curse? No, Carter didn't put stock in that kind of talk. He was a man of fire and metal, of liquor and sweat. The only spirits he dealt with were the ones he bottled and sold. But the woods had a way of changing a man's mind. At first, it was little things. The wind carried voices when there shouldn't have been any. His stills would sputter and cough at odd hours, their flames dancing in ways that made no sense. He'd find tools where he swore he hadn't left them. And the trees, they seemed to lean in closer, like they were listening. Watching. Then, the air itself grew heavy. Thick, almost syrupy, pressing in on him from all sides. It made breathing difficult, made moving feel like wading through water. The nights stretched longer. The silence between the rustling leaves became unbearable. And the darkness, it wasn't just dark. It felt alive. The first time Carter saw them, he told himself it was just a trick of the firelight. Figures, tall and thin, shifting at the edges of the trees. Too still, too silent. Watching him. They never moved when he looked at them directly. But if he turned away, even for a second, they would be closer. One night, while checking his stills, he heard his name. Not spoken. Not called. Just whispered. Soft. Cold. Carter Bale. He whipped around, lantern held high. Nothing. Just the trees, just the stills, just the flickering light casting strange shapes on the ground. But he felt it. Something was there. That night, he locked his doors, barred his windows, and sat with his shotgun in his lap. Sleep never came. Outside, the woods hummed with something unnatural. Something waiting. Then the accidents began. His best still, the one that had never given him trouble, exploded in a blast so fierce it knocked him to the ground. The fire spread fast, climbing up trees, licking at the underbrush like a living thing. He fought it, pouring water, kicking dirt, but the flames had a mind of their own. They danced and twisted, forming shapes he dared not name. By morning, the fire was gone, but the trees were untouched. The grass was still damp with dew, as if it had never happened. But Carter's hands were burned. His palms blistered, his fingertips raw. And yet, there was no soot, no ash, no sign of fire anywhere except for the pain in his skin. The next night, something knocked at his door. A single, deliberate knock. Carter didn't move. Then, another, and another. Slow, unwavering. He clenched his shotgun tighter, sweat slicking his forehead. The knocking stopped, but the air in the room shifted, grew colder, and then the door creaked open on its own. Carter didn't scream. He didn't run. He just sat there, heart pounding, staring into the nothingness beyond his threshold. The woods lay silent, waiting. That was when he knew. The curse wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And it had finally come for him. Carter Bale did everything he could to hold on to his life. He worked harder, kept his fires burning brighter, loaded his shotgun with fresh shells every night. He hung charms above his door, left offerings at the tree line, muttered prayers he had never believed in. But deep down, he knew. None of it mattered. Something had already claimed him. The air in his cabin had changed. The walls, once sturdy and thick, felt too thin, as if they could no longer keep anything out. The floorboards groaned even when he stood still. The windows, no matter how tightly he latched them, always seemed to shift open just a crack. And the woods, they weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. He barely ate, barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw things that weren't there. Long fingers curling around the edges of his bed. A face just beyond his lantern's reach. When he woke, he wasn't sure if the whispers had ever stopped or if they had simply burrowed their way inside his mind. Carter knew he was running out of time. On his final night, the knocking returned. Slow, measured. One knock, then another. A rhythm with no urgency, no impatience. Whatever stood on the other side of that door knew it would get in, sooner or later. Carter didn't wait. He grabbed his shotgun and bolted. Out the back door, into the woods, his feet pounding against the damp earth. His lantern swung wildly in his grip, casting broken light on the trees as he ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to go. But the whispers followed. Soft, breathless. Carter Bale. The trees blurred past him. His chest burned, his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't. Because if he did, a root caught his foot. He went down hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The lantern flew from his hand, rolling until the light flickered and died. Darkness swallowed him whole. He lay there, heart hammering, straining to listen. The forest held its breath. No wind. No leaves rustling. Nothing. And then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. Carter scrambled to his feet, hands shaking as he fumbled for his shotgun. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse thundering in his ears. The footsteps stopped. He forced himself to turn. And there, just beyond the reach of his vision, something stood. Not moving. Not breathing. Waiting. Carter squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, the flash lighting up the trees for a split second. Nothing was there. But the whispers never stopped. "Carter Bale." He ran again, deeper into the woods. His mind blurred with fear, his body running on nothing but instinct. He was losing himself, losing everything. His name, his past, his future. He was becoming nothing but another voice in the wind. And then, silence. By morning, Carter Bale was gone. The town searched. They combed the woods, followed the trails he had left behind. But there was nothing. No body. No footprints. Only the faint scent of burning wood, the rusted skeleton of his stills, and the eerie quiet that seemed heavier than before. His cabin sat untouched. His shotgun was never found. But late at night, when the air is thick and the moon is low, the wind carries a sound through the trees. A bubbling, like liquid still boiling deep in the woods. And if you stand there long enough, if you listen closely, you'll hear it. A name, whispered over and over. Carter Bale. Carter Bale. And if you hear it too clearly, you'd best start running. I never believed in curses. I had heard the stories, the warnings passed down from old-timers who swore that Carter Bale's cabin should have rotted away decades ago. That no one should go looking for it. That whatever happened to him was best left forgotten. But I've never been the kind of person to let a good ghost story rest. So I went looking. The woods were quiet when I stepped in, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you don't belong. No birds. No wind. Just the crunch of dead leaves under my boots and the distant drip of water from unseen branches. I followed what remained of an old trail, half buried under time, stepping over roots that curled like fingers. I thought I was alone. But then, I found it. Carter's cabin wasn't the decayed ruin I had expected. The roof had caved in, the walls had begun to sag, but it was still there. Still waiting. The door hung open, a gaping mouth, daring me to step inside. And against every instinct I did. The air inside was thick, stale, like it had been holding its breath for years. Dust clung to the few pieces of furniture left behind. An overturned chair, a broken table, a rusted shotgun leaning in the corner. I ran my fingers over the wood, feeling grooves that might have been scratches, deep, uneven, frantic. Then I heard it. A low hiss. Faint, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe a trick of the wind through the broken walls. But no, the air was still. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I stepped out of the cabin, my pulse quickening. The trail ahead was overgrown, twisted with thorn bushes that clawed at my clothes. But I kept going, pushing forward, drawn by something I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. An old metal barrel, half buried in the earth. It shouldn't have been warm. It shouldn't have been hissing. And yet, when I touched it, my fingers burned. That's when the whisper came. Soft. Dragging. Carter Bale. I felt the sound more than I heard it, like it was sinking into my bones. My breath caught, my skin prickled, and for the first time in my life, I knew. I had stepped too far into something I wasn't meant to find. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my arms, thorns tore at my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whisper followed, curling through the trees, threading through the air. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cabin was nothing but a memory behind me, until I burst from the woods and collapsed onto the roadside, gasping for breath. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is too quiet, I hear it again. A faint hissing, a whisper carried by the wind. Carter Bale. Carter Bale. And I know. The story wasn't just a story. I don't talk about that night. Not really. If someone asks, I laugh it off, say it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tell them the woods are eerie enough on their own, and if you spend too much time alone out there, you start hearing things. Seeing things. That's what I tell them. But I know the truth. I know what I heard, what I felt, and I know I was lucky to make it out. People still whisper about Carter Bale. They tell stories about his curse, about the boy who went blind, about the whispers in the woods. Some say Carter never really left, that his debt was never settled, that whatever took him is still out there, waiting. And maybe they're right, because I wasn't the last one to go looking. A few months after that night, I met a man at a roadside bar, half drunk, talking too loud about how he planned to find Carter's lost stills. Said he'd heard the stories, said he didn't believe in curses, said he wanted to see for himself. I told him not to go. He laughed. A week later, his truck was found abandoned at the edge of the woods. The door was wide open, keys still in the ignition. His footprints led into the trees. There were no footprints leading out. Search teams combed the area for days, but they never found him. Not a trace. Not a scrap of clothing. Just the truck, sitting there, engine cold, waiting for an owner who was never coming back. The sheriff chalked it up to an accident. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he fell in the river. Maybe. But I know better. Because that same night, long after the search parties had packed up and gone home, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push it all from my mind. And then, in the silence, I heard it. Soft. Dragging. Closer than ever before. That same whisper. Carter Bale. I didn't sleep that night. And I don't go near Riverbend anymore. So if you ever find yourself out there, walking too close to those woods, and you hear something that sounds like hissing, like bubbling liquid, like a voice just barely carried on the wind, keep walking. Don't turn around. Don't listen. And whatever you do, never, ever, answer when the whispers call your name. And that is the end of Carter Bale's story. Or at least, the part we know. Maybe he was taken by something ancient, something waiting just beyond the veil of what we understand. Maybe he ran so far into the trees that he simply disappeared, lost to time and memory. Or maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, in those woods, watching, listening, waiting for the next poor soul who dares to call his name. Some stories refuse to die. They linger, just beneath the surface, whispering in the dark, waiting for someone curious enough, or foolish enough, to pull back the curtain. But stories like these don't just belong to the past. They're still happening. Right now, someone, somewhere, is seeing something they can't explain. Feeling something they can't shake. And if you've ever experienced that, if you've ever stood in a place that felt wrong, if you've ever heard a voice when no one was there, if you've ever felt something watching from just beyond the light, tell me. Because the world is full of stories. Some are forgotten. Some are buried. And some are just waiting for someone like me to find them. Maybe your story is next.